on 103.3 FM KPCA LP, Petaluma, California. And today I am going to start, like I like to start all the time, by saying that this is a really community-driven radio station. And so we need your support. We had a logging-this event on May 20th, and there was a great turnout. So I really appreciate that. But we also need your continued support in order to keep this local resource available. And as I always like to say, I feel like it, my show, for example, although it does a whole bunch of different kinds of expression. But for me, being able to have this resource in Petaluma where a lot of other cities don't, in order to express your opinion and all that good stuff is an amazing tool. So, please, if you can, donate. You can also become a member. Whatever you want to do is super cool. And as always, you can contact me if you want more information, especially if you're on my Facebook page. We're friends. Alrighty, so today I am going to be talking about the economic and political divide and the effect of media. You're going to have to bear with me. I, of course, left all my notes in my office, and it was too late when I figured it out. So I just have all the data I was going to share up on my computer, but I will work on that. And actually, I got to take a second to plug it in. Okay, sorry, dead air. The last thing we wanted to do is die. Okay, so now let's get into it. So I'm going to start with economic inequality. And I think, let me take a step back. I think these are issues that people are well aware of, but in a broad sense. But I also think it's really important to, kind of highlight some of the data behind, and then, talk about media. I talk about media all the time, but talk about media influence explicitly, and then kind of do a closing. So you'll get all that. So I'm going to start by talking about economic inequality. So I have mentioned very often, public health person. If you don't know me, if you're new turning in, I have been a public health professional pretty much my entire career. So I work a lot in government. That's why I do this show, and it's so important to me. And so I'm going to talk about the social determinants of health. So the social determinants of health was kind of a new structure that has been widely adopted now. It took a long time, but it's been around for a long time. And basically, it defines the different aspects in a more realistic way, in my opinion, of the contributors to public health and health. So basically the idea, the reason that the social determinants of health were established is because it's been recognized that health is not just defined by your physical health. There are other aspects that contribute to your overall health and well-being. And so, and then again, this has resulted in, I don't actually know who came up with this. I know the state of California played a role because they've really been kind of a champion in the whole situation. So they must have. I should probably look it up, but it's been a while since I looked it up. So let's start with that. So the social determinants of health are basically based on, like I said, the different determinations. So they are access to mental health and health services, environment and built environment, education, financial stability, and community. I think I got all 5. Was that 5? I think that was 5. So it goes to show how, and today I'm going to talk a lot about, I think place is going to come up. So we always say now in public health that place matters. And so that basically means where you live matters to your overall health. And we are also going to talk about how financial stability impacts your life in general. So I bring that up, and I'm going to refer back to that during the show because I think it's an important aspect. Again, if you don't know me well or you haven't tuned in before in a while, I can't help in life relating things back to public health. It's just kind of, I always say that public health isn't a career, it's a lifestyle. So again, so we're going to start with income inequality. So let me bring up the data. Again, I forgot my notes, so I'll do this way, but it won't be terrible. So there's always this question about who the 1% is, and we talk a lot about the 1%, but I think it's kind of important to talk about the relationship with the 1% and the general population. So the 1% takes home 188 times as much income as the bottom 90%. So we'll just leave that there. So basically, there's obviously a pretty stark difference there, and even how the data is broken up. On the slide. So this is all, I should say that I always like to state my sources. So this is on equality.org, and if you just go to their data page, they have an income inequality page. So this is even broken down where it's just the top 0.1%. That's the 0.1%, not the 1%. And there's the top 1%, which the average income is 1.3 million a year. And then you have the top 5 and the top 10. So top 5 is 490,000, almost 400. And then top 10% is 322,000. So you can actually see, even between the 1% and the 0.1% of the population, there's a pretty crazy difference. And then again, so the average for the bottom 90% is $35,628 a year. So that is the average annually. So we're talking about even let's compare, I talked about the 1%. So let's compare the 90% and the 1%. So 35,000 versus 1.3 million. And then again, the top 0.1% is $6.7 million a year. So those are the differences that we're looking at in the country. So I thought that this was actually a really interesting statistic. And so if you go, I should also say, because I'm so into stating my sources, that if you go to this article on inequality.org, you'll see the original source. So this isn't biased data. It actually says, like this, for example, is from a study with Berkeley and the U.S. Census Bureau. So this is actually pulled data. Someone did their archival research in order to do this data. So the top 1% income share has doubled while poverty has held steady. And, if you look at this graph, it really is steady all the way from, what does it say? I'm losing my sight. 1960 to 2017. There's been some minor fluctuations at points which made sense, where poverty, has fluctuated. But it really has held steady. But when you talk about the income share, and, basically this is saying that this is the percentage of the total income that they're taking home on average. So, for example, in 2012, they took home 23% of the income share in the country. It actually went down a little bit in 2017. It was 21%. We're probably still waiting on the data from 2018, but I'm sure we'll see that soon. But, I don't want to get fully in my analysis yet, but it's kind of interesting looking at the ebbs and flows based on our political environment and the policies that were passed by our current administration that were originally. So, for example, in 2015, it went down 1%, and then it did go back up in 2017. Now, that doesn't seem like a huge difference, but for example, in 2007, there's 24%. So, it's just it's an indication of where our economy is at, in my opinion, because, it's not okay either way. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what I think about that. Not that it doesn't matter, but we're not at that point in the show. So, we're going to skip that one. So, even the income gaps, this is just pointing out, it's kind of what I already talked about before, that even the gap between the 1% and the top 20% is pretty huge. So, again, we have that 1.8 million for the top one. It's a little bit of a different number. This is probably just a different year. And then the top 20% is $40,000 a year. So again, we're talking, I can't do math, but that's over $1.8 million the 1% makes over the top 20 to top 40. And then another stat, since 1980, we've seen that the top 1% has had the fastest income growth compared to the bottom 20%. So we're not even talking about the entire 90% in this case. We're just talking about the bottom 20. So they've had some pretty significant income growth. And again, you can see the fluctuations based on year and probably the economic indications. But the point is, and why I brought it up before, is that there's very vast differences in the top 1%'s fluctuation in income. There's probably a lot of reasons for that I'm not going to get into. One of which I think is investment. I think that's the first one that comes to mind, is general stock investment and company investment, and how that is greatly impacted by the stock market and the economy. But really the point is that there's been really a little change. So let's see, in 1980 it was, 1983, the bottom was making negative 12% in growth in the comparison, and then now they're making 32% less than the top 1%. So clearly the rates are changing and the inequality is increasing over time. So even before the tax cut, so the idea is often that I won't go there yet, but so basically even after tax cuts in 2017, the top 1% after tax income still grew. And I think that's kind of an indication of what the policies really looked like. And so I will get into it a little bit. I did a show on the tax reform, and one of the things that we saw was this selling that the tax reform was actually going to result in people with lower incomes getting more money back. But what wasn't recognized is that they were actually taking more money out of their checks. And so they were kind of, and then a bunch of write-offs and stuff were altered for different populations. So things didn't end up the way that a lot of those poor populations, I say poor because I'm talking about the top 1%, but the top 90%, because their incomes are in that realm, the bottom 90%, sorry, things didn't turn out as people thought. And so I think that this is kind of an indication where the growth, the difference between the 1% after tax income and the bottom 20 is so vastly different, because things just didn't affect people in the way that it was sold to them. And we will get into why it's important to have a little bit more scrutiny later. So, of course, the wealthy get more income from investing. I already talked about that. I think that's kind of intuitive, because when I talked about the social determinants of health, we talk about financial stability, and there's a lot of programs now trying to teach people how to make proper investments and save in order to have more wealth. And so that's a big movement right now, because that is a way to establish, long-term income versus paycheck to paycheck, and having savings so that if anything happens, you can live off that. But I live in a county where that's very difficult. If you live here, because the incomes are not keeping up. They're not even close to keeping up with the changes in housing, for example, and then the increases in housing increase your general standard of living. So we're seeing that that's not really changing. I did a show last week or 2 weeks ago on the state of Sonoma County, so you can look back to that. So again, I think a lot of this data is kind of showing the same thing. Paychecks are increasing for the more wealthy, while the poorer populations, it's staying stagnant. So again, that talks a lot about this stark difference that, and I always, unfortunately, what we're seeing now is that it's being sold that it's a decrease in unemployment, but what we're seeing is a significant amount of jobs that are low paying jobs, which is not sustainable. So let's see. Oh, this is an interesting one. Okay. So I wanted to point this one out because we'll get into the political divide. We're kind of getting to that. We're getting close to that point. So as unions decline, inequality becomes more extreme. So unions are an interesting thing because, if you kind of know the history of the political parties, they've kind of flipped somehow in how they, to some extent, how they look at things. And so the unions were really driven by the Democratic Party in order to instill kind of more of a democracy in businesses. And so, of course, as that declines, the employees have less of a say in their health benefits, their pay rates, their pay scale. So it's not shocking that union membership, as it goes down, the top 1% makes more. So because there's not this, this is my theory, but it's because there isn't this conversation about what should the income rates be, and it's always a negotiation, but I think that that level of transparency and accountability and negotiation is healthy for companies and the country. So women are a small percent of the top earners. If you didn't know that, then can't help you right now. And then it gets in some racial inequalities, and so I'll give you one because that's something that's on my notes, is that white and Asian wages are over 30% higher than Black and Latino wages, and then we know that there is a difference in those as well among the different race ethnicities. So let's get into that. It talks about the CEO wage gap. Again, I think that's something that's kind of been covered pretty well in the major media. So let's move into, this is actually a really random stat, but the U.S. restaurant servers haven't gotten a raise in 28 years. So basically, that's a thing, right? It goes to show why, again, in Sonoma County, I think probably all over the state, but especially in a very tourist-heavy area, restaurants are having a hard time retaining servers. And I think it's just this, and it's not on the restaurant. The restaurant, there's kind of this structure, and I think a lot of the restaurants would like to pay more, but a lot of the smaller ones are the ones that are having the hard time retaining employees, because there's kind of this issue of trying to figure out how to manage all the income. And again, like, rents are way up. It's commercial rents too. It's not just personal rents. So rents are way up, costs are way up, and so that's an issue, but wages aren't up. So, and again, Sonoma County, maybe people are going out less. I don't know, because they just can't, a vast majority of the population can't really afford to go out and, you know, really sustain a life in this county that perhaps they want. Everyone's life is their own. Y'all do you, right? So there are results, getting back to the social determinants of health, there are results of being poor. So this income inequality and the income instability and financial health can affect your general health. And it makes sense, right? You have lower access to all the other social determinants of health. So you have lower access to education, strong education. We know California is really bad in the education category, and the United States in general is not fabulous. Of the developed world, it affects where you live. So it likely affects the environment and built environment that you're living in. It affects your access to health and mental health services. And so all of those things, and it can affect your social connections if you're living more isolated. So I think that that's something that's really important to point out. So again, I've done shows that really talk about this more in depth, but I wanted to bring it up because I think it really does it contributes to the political divide, but systematic racism, incarceration rates, and geographical location of where you actually live in the country. So we know incomes are higher on the coasts. And so if you're living in more of a low opportunity geographical location, if you're in jail or prison, or if you're living in a neighborhood with a lack of resources, it's obviously going to affect your political opinions and all that kind of stuff. And your processing of life, right? These things really affect everything in our lives. And health impacts result in lower productivity. And we actually see that in our GDP rates and then in individual company data. You see that if you have an unhealthy workforce in the country, it can actually affect GDP. So as the country becomes more unhealthy, which it is, they're predicting that for the first time, the younger generations are going to live shorter lives than their parents. That is a big deal. We haven't seen that, and I don't know what the data is, but a very, very, very long time. So that kind of goes to show that the country's becoming more unhealthy. So all these reasons really do lead to the political divide. And it's very clear that it has gotten worse over time. I will say that it does ebb and flow, but I would think because of the many contributing factors to the political divide, that in my opinion, it has gotten worse. Just across the board, taking out all the individual kind of specifics that can generally affect these kind of divides, just in general, saying, yeah, I mean, it's gotten worse. So I forgot my notes, so I don't have it all cleanly done, so I got to bring this up. This kind of gets into, I'm sorry if you lost me there on Facebook for a second, I got a phone call. This kind of gets into the media, but we'll just start with it because it's the first window I have open. So this data is talking about the percent of adults that say that made up news and information is a result of the news media versus the Trump administration. So 23% of Republicans believe that made-up news is due to the news media, while 15% of Democrats do, reportedly. So I'm assuming they asked about a bunch of different factors that could be contributing to fake news. But so on the Trump administration contributing to fake news, 7% of the Republicans believe it's up to Trump, or based on Trump and his administration. So they did lump them together. Or while only 16% of Democrats surveyed believed in that. And this was actually just done compiled between February 19th and March 4th. And so, I forgot already. So this data is from the Pew Research Center. So you can find it all there. And I think I just Googled Pew Research Center political divide. So if you can find it that way. So I think that I'm going to try to go in order. Hold on. Give me 1 second. Okay. So this is a good one. This is this is from February 2019. So this is really new data, and it talks about the difference in top priorities for Republicans versus Democrats, and this has to do with their key priorities for president and Congress in 2019. So this should basically be, it's a whole kind of list of where, the priorities fall. And I mean, really the basic thing is that there's different kind of things that fall, and they're relatively different. So some of the priorities for the Republicans are, let me make sure I get this right. This is kind of hard to read. This one always a great table when it's hard to read, but I want to make sure. Okay. So the Republicans take greater priority for terrorism, the economy, immigration, military, crime, budget deficit, global trade. And the Democrats' priorities include climate change, environment, drug addiction, it's an interesting one, race relations, poor and needy, healthcare and education, and Medicare. So you can see that I don't think one of those was a repeat at all of the two. So you can see how, not having aligned priorities can be an issue, because then constantly, I mean, if you can't come to together as a country and have a bipartisan conversation and say, hey, so we need to establish some of the key priorities, and you have a list from the Republicans and you have a list from the Democrats, and they're completely different, it's going to be pretty hard to agree on what the priority should be. And so I think that that's kind of how we've had a very split Congress. And so this is an indication to show why one side of Congress, the other side of Congress can't agree, because they have very different priorities coming through from their constituents, if they're even listening to their constituents. A lot of politicians have made it very clear that they don't listen properly to their constituents. But in theory, they are acting on behalf of what the constituent priorities are. So again, and if they're completely different, and this research is brand new, it's from 2019, and I think it's just an important amount of information, and we're going to get back to that because I know it comes up. And for example, climate change specifically is an arena where there is a huge disagreement about what climate change is and what the individual beliefs are and what contributes to it and if it's real. So those are, major things to consider. And of course, I am losing all my, there we go. It would just be appropriate that I forgot my notes. I lose functionality of my computer, just have to wing it. I can do it if I have to. So Let's get to that one right before we go to media. And let me see. I know I have another one. Well, interestingly enough, that more Republicans believe that 2019 will be better than 2018. Democrats believe it's going to be a worse year for the most part. But so that's an interesting relationship there. And yeah, so, and then let me see if there's any other data. Again, you gotta bear with me for a second, but I want to make sure. Okay, yeah, so Republicans tend to point more towards Trump as the reason for optimism, and the optimism specifically about the economy. And, you know, some of the topics that it's talking about, the reason for the optimism, so the highest one is for Republicans is Donald Trump. The next is economy and jobs, just general optimism. People are just generally happy. That's not terrible. So it just possibly can't get worse. That's actually just can't get worse. It can't possibly get worse. Which is actually pretty uneven divide. It's 9% of Republicans and 11% of Democrats just think it can't possibly get worse. And then so this is another pretty stark difference, is that 27% of Democrats contribute the optimism to Democrats in Congress keeping Trump in check, while only 2% of Republicans responded that way. So the wall, this is something I want to talk about. So the wall or secured borders, 12% of Republicans have attributed that to the optimism, or why 2019 is going to be a better year than 2018, and 0% of Democrats reported that would be the case. So let's get into some of why there is a pretty significant difference in a certain area. So I've picked out topics that have a very clear difference in opinion to discuss, because, you know, might as well kind of talk about, and again, I think the whole point of this show is to go to show that the issues and disagreement is very vast in a lot of categories. Like I just mentioned, the priorities are completely different between the two parties. So that creates polarization. But I wanted to say that, so this is specifically about Catholics, which I think is interesting. But it talks about climate change and abortion, and yeah, I mean, it pretty much is completely the opposite on the Democratic versus the Republican side. And then it compares all U.S. adults, which shows that 78% of Democrats believe that the world is warming, while 76% of Republicans believe that it is not warming. So 22% of Democrats believe that it's not warming. But, so again, you can see 78% of Democrats believe the earth is warming. 76% of Republicans believe the world is not warming. And so, and then percent that are sharing about whether abortion should be legal. I like to call it pro-choice, not legalization of abortion, but, you know, again, we'll get into the messaging later. So, Democrats, 64% of Democrats think that it should be legal. This is all or most cases, so it hasn't broken it down into most or not. So it's the whole gamut of reasons. And then the 55% of Republicans believe it should be illegal, that are Catholics. Sorry, that's so 64% of Democrats who are Catholics believe it should be legal. 58%, 55% of Republicans that are Catholics believe it's not. Again, random data, but why not? It's in front of me. So then for all U.S. residents, 76% of Democrats believe that abortion should be legal, and then 58%, it's 55%, think it shouldn't be. And so I think that the reason that this data is interesting, because there's no difference between being Catholic and not, and then it being illegal with Republicans. And I think the reason they're pulling out the Catholics, because there's a lot of rules about, what is a life, and when if you have the right to terminate a life, and so it gets very biblical in the rules. So I don't want to get into that, but I think that's why they're making the comparison to kind of show that there is a difference. There's over a 10% difference between Catholic Democrats and non-Catholic Democrats, but there's no difference between Republicans and all Republicans and non-Republicans. So let's talk about the border wall. So 93% of Democrats are opposed to expansion of the border wall, while 82% of Republicans are in favor of expanding the border wall. Now, let's take a second to talk about that one. You want to talk about a vast political divide? I mean, that is so significant. 93% of Democrats oppose, 82% of Republicans are in favor. That really highlights the major difference. I think that it's even more stark than climate change. I mean, this is a huge hot button issue right now, and it's so split among the parties. So let's talk about this, because this is, let me make sure that I got through kind of what I wanted to do there. So let's talk about the border wall, because I think it's a perfect example of where this political polarization has occurred. So it's very clear that there is a huge disagreement between Republicans and Democrats about whether the border wall should be expanded. And I also would be interested to know where the consideration is for the source of funding. But as it was stated in the campaign that Mexico would be responsible for paying for the wall, they're of course saying that they're not going to pay for the wall. But that was the claim. So I'm assuming that is still a believed claim. I don't know. Again, I would love to talk to these people that believe in expanding the border wall and talk to them about why they want to expand the border wall, and kind of the rationale, and then also kind of getting down to the nitty-gritty. I'm not sure that a lot of people think about why they oppose or favor something in general, because when we have a political divide, it then results in people voting on party lines and thinking on party lines. And so that's really the crux of the issue with a political divide right there, is that when people start just making decisions based on the political party they are affiliated with, they are no longer thinking about what the issue is, what the consequence of the issue going through is, and that can have a lot to do with lack of access of information or understood information, because policy is written by lawyers, and it's very confusing and very hard to distill down. And then, I think this just lack of open communication further leads to the polarization. So even me being able to say, I would be very glad, and Van Jones is doing this whole campaign about it too right now, is going out across the country, or within your means, maybe it's a local coffee shop that you wouldn't go to, or seeing a lecture from a speaker that you wouldn't normally agree with. But going and being able to assess what the other side sees and says. And I've been saying this since after the last election, that what has been created with the political divide is that we don't talk to each other anymore. We scream at each other. And a nation divided is more easily controlled. I'm sure that's an actual quote from someone. But without being able to have conversations across the table, we get this vast and increasing political divide. And so those are things that really need to be considered. And I don't think it's a change overnight, but let's get into the media influence into these things, because it is a major issue to talk about. And so let me get into, so I do have a couple statistics about media. So Republicans are more likely than Democrats to say local journalists should not express views on local issues. So I'm making a presumption here because, again, it was kind of hard to understand the table. So I'm making the assumption that they are saying that local journalists shouldn't express their personal opinions about local issues. That's really the only way I can read it, because I don't know why. I mean, obviously local journalists are going to share local stories. So I think this is more about their personal views on local issues. Yeah. And I've heard it before from more liberal people too. So really a total of the population is 61%. So I have heard it from the 61%. And Republicans believe, 71% of Republicans believe that local journalists should not express local view or their views on local issues, and 54% of Democrats. And, I am going to say that I very much disagree with this. And again, over half the population in general does agree with this. And I don't. I think that there's a time and place. I obviously don't think that journalists over their news medium or their writing medium, unless they're doing an editorial, I don't think that they should be biased in their reporting, but I think in their individual lives, they should be more than welcome to express their personal views. Again, depending on the level of journalism you're at, you might need to be more careful about how you express it in order to make sure that it's not an indication of your agency, not representing your agency. But I think this has really fueled this media and political divide, that now we're saying that individual people should not be allowed to express their opinions just because they're a journalist. And journalism, again, you want it to be unbiased as possible, but you're also always getting the perspective of that person in journalism. And I think stripping that away from them and saying that your view doesn't matter kind of takes away from the storytelling process. And so, and investigative journalism, I feel like that kind of, tampers with investigative journalism, if that's even a thing anymore. It used to be a thing, maybe on the local level. But so I think that those are really important things to look at. So the effect of media, again, I talk about this all the time, and we all know about the fake news. We know about the international influence in our previous elections. We now know that there's an international influence on our current news and how we're getting information. And I think that this has somewhat come down to how we receive our information. And it gets back to, so those three factors, but also included that is biased media. So radio, TV stations that explicitly only express one opinion. That's not journalism. So again, even if you have your individual views, you just have to make sure that you cover all the individual views. I mean, that's a simple way to cover that basis. And then, so all three of those things have really contributed to the breakdown in thinking. I mean, we know that we know there's been a decline in critical thinking training in all levels of education for one reason or the other, but I think that this lack of critical thinking skills, even if it's not, you don't need to be some brilliant, high IQ person to do critical thinking. Critical thinking is a skill that anyone can learn, and it's just a reminder that you need to be critical of the information you're reading, the information that you're saying, And, I have conversations with people about saying, like, you really shouldn't talk about things you don't know about. And you really need to look into your sources. Because if they're biased, they're biased. If there isn't both sides of the conversation occurring and that source is biased. That's just the way. And it might not be within the same article. It may not be within the same webpage. But there needs to be a consideration for the other side of the table. And of course, like, a lot of news media is biased now. Again, journalism has kind of been dead for a while, where it was really just telling the story, getting the news out, getting information out. Now it's more, I want to get information out that influences your opinion about your political opinion, your life choices, all that kind of stuff now is really fueled by media. And we've known for a long time that advertising has really influenced people's choices, and big advertising budgets obviously result in way more people utilizing their product, which has created, in some cases, a very unhealthy country. So when we look at Coca-Cola's budget and all these other companies like that, they are really influencing certain populations. And there was a huge campaign for a while talking about how Coca-Cola specifically was targeting people of color in order to buy their drinks, and because on average they have lower incomes, and because people with more money just weren't drinking Coke anymore, because they had the information behind how unhealthy it is. And not to say, that's not a mass generalization, that's actual data. So saying that people with more money don't drink soda is a generalization. I'm not saying that everyone doesn't drink soda. I know plenty of people with money that drink soda. So again, we have this whole online structure that has really contributed to the breakdown of media, because now everyone is a reporter, everyone's a photographer, everyone's a videographer, and everyone can tell the news. Everyone and anyone can tell the news. There's no sources on a lot of what is written, and I call people out when they post stuff that has no sources. I call them out on it, because there's no backing in this. Again, unless it's an editorial, there should be sources if you're stating data. And then, the headlines. The example I always use is that science indicates correlation, not causation. And so a lot of headlines will say, this causes this, and that's just not how the scientific process works. Most of those studies don't have articles, they're not studies. They don't have any reference to actual data. They're just saying stuff. And then people believe that. I mean, it's a really difficult thing. And reading scientific research, I realize, is not for everyone. It's dry and it's hard. I'm into it, but people aren't into it. Fine. So, but you need to have some sort of a source that you can review back and is a trusted, somewhat academic source or trusted source, like the Pew Research Center. I mean, that's a pretty trusted source of information across the board. So I'm running out of time already. So let's kind of just get into the solutions. Again, I think people realize that media is impacting our political and economic divide, especially the political divide, which is led to by the economic divide. So really it comes back to, and I think I mentioned this almost in every single one of my shows, but that it really comes back to the ability to have conversations across the table, establishing what good sources are of information, and, understanding where to get it. I think that information where there's more general input, I wish, so there are, I know that my friend developed a platform for publishing scientific articles, and then it also works to omit kind of scientific articles that aren't relevant. There is now, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of it, I'm blanking on it right now. I just came across a company or platform called Credder that is trying to somewhat, in my opinion, democratize news, where it actually involves both vetted journalists and individuals rank news articles based on a set of criteria. So there are platforms where you can at least get the generalized opinion of where other people stand on the article, and then you can also make your own educated decision about where you stand on the article. It's not to say that you're going to agree with the masses. I often disagree with the masses. So those are some resources if you are looking. And really, the point of mentioning that is it doesn't matter what the individual platform is. It's more about understanding where the information came from, having conversations with people. God forbid we be able to actually talk to people. Like, have a constructive conversation. And I always tell you, if you're going to post stuff on social media, make sure it's fact-checked, make sure it's sourced, and just try having conversations with people. You know, there's a lot of trolls out there, and the joke is that someone's in their mom's basement. I've had trolls come after my blogs, my posts, my public posts, and ignore that. It's not worth reacting to, but do what you can. Our education system in the United States is embarrassing compared to the rest of the developed world and some of the undeveloped world. That's not the right word, but so the developing world. There we go. That was the right way to put it. So that is a huge contributor, is that we don't have the education, kids in other states are learning. This is where the geographical location matters. Kids in other states are learning from textbooks that are like 30 years old and have written out a lot of history. And, to some extent that can be based on construct of keeping people unaware. And I think that is a big thing, is trying to keep people unaware and kind of distracted with other issues that aren't important, while, more important decisions are being made that really impact your lives. And I talk about that a lot on my show as well, because I try to distill down policy and issues so that people realize like what is really going on and what's really important at this time to address, instead of being hung up on, what the mass media or everyone posting on social media, what they're focusing on. It's not to say that that's not important, but generally there is this media distraction kind of thing to draw. And there's obviously political influence in media. So you'd be silly to think that there isn't political influence in media. So, it's not getting distracted. It's staying as objective as possible. It's helping your friends also stay objective. It's having good conversations. It's learning, and it's to some extent, it's this pie in the sky, like we're all going to hold hands and get along. That's never going to happen. We're not all going to get along. That's not what I'm suggesting. But we can at least consider someone else's opinion in a productive manner. Not listen to respond, actually listen, take it in, maybe think about how to respond, fact check them. I fact check people all the time. I fact check myself all the time. Like, I don't like saying things that I don't know what I'm saying. So I am totally out of time. I ran out of time. If you want to talk more about this, please contact me. If you're on Facebook, you know how to find me. If you are on the radio, you can email me at domayne@maberme.com. This is obviously a very complex topic. So please contact me if you want to talk more. I got an open door policy. I got an open table to talk across policy. So you, again, are listening to KPCA-LP, Petaluma, California, 103.3 FM. And I forgot to say before I close out, I got to do that again. But before I close out, you will find me, not next week, but the week after. So I am every other week at 7 p.m. You can check out the schedule at kpca.fm to tune into all of our programs. We have a lot now, so please check that out and see which shows that you want to participate in. We have a lot of good talk. We have a lot of good music, so check that out. Thanks for joining me tonight on State of the Union with Gigi the 30-something.